However, in the morning of the 20th of May, on the anniversary, the Kiev regime tried to hit it with long-range missiles specifically supplied by the Western countries, as if trying to take their revenge on the people of Mariupol for their choice to live in Russia, to live in peace, in accord with each other, with no hatred, in love. Fortunately, as a result of the attack, the inhabitants of this city and its rebuilt neighborhoods have not been hit. It is emblematic that the 20th of May will become the day of liberation of another large city in the DPR, Artyomovsk. This process will continue. Donbas will be rid from Bandera fascists. No matter how frantic Zelensky regime becomes in its pro-Western rage, no matter what provocations the Western countries organize, they will not succeed because they will be pushed back. And of course, they will not succeed in obscuring the victory in Artyomovsk. The May 22nd sabotage raid, designed to give Kiev's NATO handlers a false impression of the Ukrainian armed forces' high combat effectiveness, has failed. Such terrorist sorties will be cracked down hard on, and the terrorist nature of the Kiev regime and that of its handlers is something we do not need to expound on any further because the evidence is there. They strike against civilians, against peaceful life. Their sole goal is to intimidate people rather than liberate them or bring peace or do something that is necessary in order for security to be established. Instead, they choose to strike civilian infrastructure in order to sow fear and entrench their hatred for those who think differently. This is the very definition of terrorism and extremism which is currently flourishing in Kiev. This is what the Kiev regime is guided with. It's another proof of the same thing. We see more aggressive statements by Western officials who make no bones about their appeals to bomb peaceful Russian regions. True enough, they are being treacherous because they do not recognize themselves as party to the conflict. They speak about assistance to the Kiev regime, about the need to, as is their favorite line, restore democracy or bring freedom and so on and so forth. However, the truth is, just think about what the Western officials say. The US President's Assistant on National Security, Sullivan, said that Washington had given Ukraine its approval to strike Crimea. He even gave some explanations. According to him, in the American vision, the peninsula is part of Ukraine. Therefore, unlike geographical Russian territory, it can be struck. It sounds cynical, especially considering that the Kiev regime is supposed to value the lives of its citizens that it allegedly wants to liberate. There is another, even more cynical thing. Let us remember that over many decades, the main principle of American foreign policy was human rights. Where are these human rights now? Apparently they got lost along the way. At what point did Washington forget that there are people there, civilians? Right now, with these broad gestures, they enable the Kiev regime to strike Crimea. Does Washington know that there are people living in Crimea, namely civilians, who go to their jobs on a daily basis, who take their children to kindergartens and schools? Or have they forgotten about that? Perhaps all this line about human rights is only to be touted at political conferences and at international organizations where Washington needs to lobby its position, to receive some votes in order to legalize its unilateral activities. It is a blatant example, and I believe that it fully unveils the true nature and the hidden designs of America's foreign policy. Ukrainian authorities no longer think that Crimeans or inhabitants of Russia's new regions to be their citizens. To confirm the true inhumane nature of the neo-Nazi junta in Kiev, we heard new statements by Budanov, head of the main intelligence directorate of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. Just listen to this. They have plans to physically exterminate the undesirable inhabitants of Crimea. According to him, he even gave some numbers. He came prepared. There are 3 million modified people. And there will be, according to him, a lot of work to destroy them. In this regard, Kiev officials are not unlike their ideological idols who gave relevant orders to kill subhumans who are not supposed to live and procreate. I'm talking about the Third Reich right now. To imagine that we hear such remarks from people who are received as officials in a number of countries is impossible, but it is true. Advisor to the head of the office of the Ukrainian President Mikhail Podoliak also made some interesting remarks. He wished Russians to live as Neanderthals. That was a direct quote right now. In their essence, they are guided by Nazi ideology. That's clear to everyone at this point. Right now, there are no longer any doubts about that. Their activities are sponsored by the West because the West follows essentially the same logic. Just think about it. First, we heard video footage and saw video footage and heard remarks from President Poroshenko of Ukraine, who promised Donbas citizens that they would live in basements and their children would live in basements, and they, the Kiev regime, will enjoy the fruits of civilization. Josep Borrell, the High Representative of the EU for Foreign Policy and Diplomacy, made similar remarks when he categorized all people into those who live in a beautiful garden and those who live in a jungle. It's more of the same. They think they have the right to choose, to decide who is civilized and who is uncivilized. And they are fully detached from the reality, from the legal realities and facts. Aside from all that, all of these representatives of the Kiev regime are barely literate. These are just people who were trained to repeat some Nazi slogans. And they have no principles. They are ready to service any and all ideology, even these the most extreme, when it comes to their compatriots. And they were assigned to such high offices. But if Podoliak had any notion of the planet he lives on, if he had read something, he would have probably known that the Neanderthals come from the Neanderthal Valley name. Right now, I'm going to shatter Podoliak's fragile world, but this valley, the Neanderthal Valley, is in Germany. I feel sorry for the people who make such remarks without understanding the meaning of the words that they say. And we are hardly surprised because hatred for one's historic roots is the foundation, the pillar of ideology of current Ukrainian authorities, self-denial amid complete and blatant illiteracy. Amid the backdrop of Russian liberatory forces' successes, the Ukrainian traveling circus is continuing its tour. Not my words, it was very aptly used by French journalists. Right now, begging for new military assistance, the main personality in this traveling circus went to Hiroshima, to the G7 summit. The results of this voyage by Zelensky were disappointing. A lot of PR, promises, smiles, but zero specifics. The US gave him $375 million only, and he was sad to receive that little because it was but a drop in the ocean compared to what he asked for. Any supplies of weapons to the Kiev regime will not cancel the goals and purposes set when the special military operation started. All of these assistance, so-called assistance, brings about nothing but escalation and new casualties among those serving in the armed forces, various fighting units, and civilians. The Western handlers of Ukraine, including Washington, London, and Brussels, do not care for Ukrainian citizens. It doesn't matter to them how many Ukrainians die, how they suffer. Their main goal is to use them as a tool. Their single care is to ensure that there are people who will who will serve as a conduit of their destructive ideology. As long as there are such people, it doesn't matter how these people live. The only thing that matters to them is that it serves the Western interests. This destructive logic has become the foundation of NATO's leadership's ideals. The Western weapons provided to the Ukrainian regime are a legitimate target for the Russian military. Recently, a Patriot missile system was hit in Kiev by the Russian armed forces. For the West, Ukraine is a testing ground to test their weapons, and the Kiev regime representatives directly addressed Western defense agencies, requesting that they use the Ukrainian territory as a testing ground for new weapons. We have given a lot of comments on this topic. The fact that such weapons end up in the hands of Ukrainian citizens without preliminary testing is not a concern for the Ukrainian regime or those who sponsor it. Right now we see the development of this ideology. The conflict, according to the Kiev regime, and its Western handlers, is a nice occasion to modernize weapons and test them not only in the Ukrainian territory but also on Ukrainian citizens. Spain is currently holding the largest weapons exhibition, which exhibits over 500 exhibits from 25 countries, 100 delegations from all over the world, and 25,000 military professionals. Also weapons that are currently used in Ukraine. Thanks to the Western politics, Ukraine has become the perfect place to test new weapons strategies and tactics of hybrid warfare. Right now, the war business of Western countries has received a boost. For them, the main thing is to ensure that this military conflict is never ending. The US and its satellites are ready to continue pumping Ukraine full of weapons and follow their logic of fighting to the last Ukrainian, something that is a must for the West. The West likes to say that Ukraine is making great strides towards democracy and human rights respect. However, democratic freedoms in this country have only been seen when it comes to holding certain types of parades, namely gay pride parades. As for political rights of citizens, today's Kiev society has not heard it. I cannot call it civil society in full conscience. Recently, Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Danilov, said to PACE chairman Tiny Cox, when Cox asked whether Ukraine remembered its obligation to conduct presidential elections in 2024, as is the law. According to Danilov, Kiev will decide on the matter on itself without assistance from outside. The shards of the country that exist only thanks to the outside assistance coming from the West. I mean, all kinds of assistance, weapons, medicines, all kinds of products, basically everything they need to survive. And a representative of this country tells the West that they need no assistance in political matters, not only when it comes to internal politics, but when it comes to respecting the law that they wrote based on the Western instruction. They said they need no assistance. This is what terrorist groups typically do. Another noteworthy fact from the democratic Ukraine, the downfall period, when Polish politicians urged Ukraine to apologize for the Volhynia massacre, when Banderites killed dozens of thousands of ethnic Poles between 1943 and 1944, Kiev officials, who are ardent admirers and followers of Bandera, reacted with outrage and firm refusal. Despite their seemingly allied relations with Warsaw, they were even ready to unite with Poland and become a single state. We wonder how this might happen, given the historically undeniable facts that worry both societies at the instigation of the political figures there.
But Russia should get accustomed to the Kiev chant, because there will be no change in this issue, because it's an existential issue for them. The Bandera logic will be followed, and it will be increased. The Western mentors try not to notice the scale of corruption in Ukraine. There is a huge amount of examples. The American media widely covered this issue, and there are even fresh examples. It's something from the works of Gogol. The arrest of the head of the Supreme Court of Ukraine for crimes amounting to 2.5 billion euro. It's the Supreme Court of Ukraine, whose head was arrested for bribes. 11 of his colleagues were suspected of similar crimes. So it's the Kiev democracy with Washington mentorship. One more example of the so-called observation of human rights in Ukraine. And I would like to add that all those appointed during the Zelensky regime and during the regime of Poroshenko, they were with the participation of Washington, of the White House and other structures. They were like some HR agency for serving the Kiev regime. The Ukrainian government, it just had Canada and the US citizens and the citizens of other NATO countries and all the references that the Western mentors do not know what is currently happening on the territory of Ukraine. Those conversations do not bear any criticism because by their hands for decades they have been created that HR, those governing in Kiev, those people were appointed by the US. They were accepted by the US, and that's the result. One more detail regarding observing the human rights, non-observation of human rights in Ukraine. The Service of Catastrophe Medicine, part of the Health Ministry of Ukraine, has been taking for transplantation in secret the organs of the Ukrainian army soldiers. This fact is concealed from the relatives, and the international structure try to present that they do not notice that fact. And we will provide more detailed information today about that. And the mercenarism is also on the rise in Ukraine. Polish mercenaries get free plots of land in the west of the country, in Volyn, Lviv, and Zakharova regions. And the Ukrainian legislation now envisages preferential loans and house building for the families of the dead mercenaries, but it does not concern the Ukrainian citizens anyhow. Their opinion is not considered. I am sure that all the traits are obvious that the West is conducting an ethnical purge of Ukrainians in the west of Ukraine, because such catastrophe that is now underway, such catastrophe can have no other description. Everything is done for total annihilation of the Ukrainians as a people, as a community. Firstly, they were deprived of history and forced to rewrite it. Then they just were corrupted. Then the coup d'etat was forced in violation of all the rules and orders and laws of the country that was just forming its institutions. And then the phase of the bloody internal conflict followed. And then they were used in order, so to say, as they say, imposed defeat on Russia. This can be qualified as an attempt, apart from destabilization of the situation in the world and counter our country, to fulfill the task not fulfilled by the Western Europe in the middle of the 20th century. How can the sponsorship of mercenaries from the budget that for the participation in armed conflict where the Ukrainian citizens die and those mercenaries are given land, it cannot be understood. I am sure that the history does not know anything like that, no precedent even in ancient history. The legislation of Ukraine, as I have already said, has a whole range of benefits for mercenaries, preferential loans, building houses by the Ukrainian taxpayers. And it is actually a genocide of their own people. The Kiev regime is freely giving land to foreigners. And just think about that. For many years, the citizens who were forced to live in several countries after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They were denied second citizenship on the territory of Ukraine, of the second passport, being told that they just need to be the citizens of Ukraine. And the government included people with different passports. And with regard to the citizens who had relatives in many post-Soviet countries and other countries in the world, they were denied second passport and second citizenship. And the measures were taken against them. But now foreigners can receive beneficial land just in order to continue that conflict, that bloody conflict. It's a really horrible history. Actually, some inhumane material published by the Serbian media outlet. It's with regard to the article Bloody Squad of Elizabeth de Brue. It's about a doctor who came to the vicinity of Artomovsk. It is about the taking away the organs of the Ukrainian servicemen dead or heavily wounded in Donbass. It's not the first mention by the Serbian media outlet Pechat of the illegal black transplantation. So it's already a fact. It's a real business in the area of the armed conflict, and it is a highly beneficial business. And we all know that the existence of this horrible bloody business is impossible without patronship at the level of the government, at the highest level. And it has not only been covered by our country, but also international organizations, namely the UN, the United Nations Organization, its human rights bodies. In the recent remarks by the Committee on the Rights of the Child of October 2022 and the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women in November 2022, there was mention of widespread of trade in women and children for sexual exploitation in Ukraine. It's not the data of our country, it's the UN data. From the end of the 1990s, there have been some pieces of information in the media about the poor citizens selling their organs, and there were testimonies of illegal extraction of anatomic materials from dead people. And Ukraine was in the center of scandals connected with the illegal transplantology well before the coup d'etat of 2014 and the events that followed. However, the beginning of hostilities in the southeast of the country just aggravated the situation. Now we just need to highlight the activities of black transplantologists in the country. And Alexander Zakharchenko, former DPR head, noted that he saw repeatedly the corpses with open chests and with extracted organs. Such foundings that are really horrible are not rare, unfortunately. In July 2022, the LPR People's Militia officer Andrei Marochko stated that black transplantologists in Ukraine get 20-30 people every day, and mostly those are servicemen of the armed forces of Ukraine. And we are still concerned about the real reason for the use of field crematoriums by the Ukrainian side. Namely, in the Ukrainian legislation, the agreement for transportation procedure has been facilitated, and they have been made VAT-free. And the last change in that has been made by the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine in April 2022, already after the start of the special military operation. Of course, the Kiev regime denies the work of the black transportologists by citing the reason that it is a highly demanding exercise that requires a lot of specialists, a lot of time, a lot of tests for donor and for the recipient, and so on. Ukrainian healthcare specialists say that it is impossible to extract a kidney or a heart in the front line on the ground. And I would like to cite a fact that in former Yugoslavia, on the Albanian territory, there have been transplantation operations discovered by the investigators of the International Tribunal on former Yugoslavia. And Carla Del Ponte, in her book The Hunt, Me and the War Criminals, described those facts. And in the report of the PACE representative of Switzerland, Dick Marty, and following that report, the parliamentarians agreed to bring to responsibility all those guilty of trade in organs. If such operations were possible at the end of the 90s in Albania, now the extraction of organs in Ukraine just requires attention and requires urgent international efforts for monitoring and for taking countermeasures. To move on, I would like to say a few words about Poland issuing a jubilee coin to honor Joseph Courage. It's the history that a long history of falsification of historic facts, rewriting the outcome of the Second World War. Unfortunately, there is a massive campaign in Poland to forget the Soviet soldiers who fought with the Poles during the Second World War, and the work is underway to glorify the so-called cursed soldiers who did not want to go back to peaceful life after the war, and killed many Poland and Soviet law enforcement employees, and also killed civilians. The coin has been issued in March 2023 to honor Joseph Courage, who was active at the border with Slovakia. And in August 2006 in Zakopane, in the presence of Lech Kaczynski, his monument was inaugurated. And Joseph Courage, his unit, are guilty of many war crimes against civilians, particularly with regard to ethnic Slovaks who lived on the territories of Northern Spiš and Upper Orava, which, according to the outcome of the Second World War, became a part of Poland, and also crimes against the Jews and other nationalities. It's no surprise that the Slovak and Jewish minorities of Poland are against that glorification. However, Warsaw continues to ignore those calls. Maybe they think that they will be able to rewrite that history in media and to make it seem the only true history. But the end, it will be very sad, as it has been before. We'll go on to other topics. the 79th session of the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific of the UN, ESCAP. The main topic of the session has become the strengthening of activities in combating climate change in Asia-Pacific regions for sustainable developments. We have taken advantage of this event to promote the Russian approaches for regional industry cooperation. And there have been two events organized for climate monitoring and by the Ministry of Economic Development and the UN Association of Russia. According to the outcome of the 79th ESCAP session, Russia co-sponsored two of the 10 resolutions, and we would like to thank all our colleagues for support. We intend to further cooperate with our Asia-Pacific region partners on the platform of ESCAP in a non-politicized and constructive manner.
Today, on the 24th of May, we celebrate the Day of Slavic Writing and Culture. This holiday reminds us about the common origins of Slavic language and is a vivid evidence of the unbreakable historic connection and cultural unity of Slavic people. As you probably know, this year's festivities coincide with the year of the Russian language as the language of international communication declared in the CIS. The Russian language is the main means of international communication in the Commonwealth. It helps strengthen the humanitarian dialogue, cooperation and mutual understanding. The central event of the holiday will take place in Moscow on Red Square, supported by the Ministry of Culture and the government of Moscow. His Holiness Patriarch Kirill of Moscow and all Russia will give a welcoming address at the holiday concert. This year we have dedicated it to the year of teacher and mentor in Russia, the year of the Russian language in the CIS, the 150th anniversary of the birth of Rachmaninoff and Chalyapin. Valery Gergiev, Denis Matsuev, leading opera singers, will perform at the concert. Additional information will be provided in the text of the briefing. One of the key priorities for our country on its external humanitarian track is supporting and promoting the Russian language abroad. A significant contribution to the development of international cooperation in this area is made by the Kostomarov Forum at the Pushkin State Institute of the Russian Language, which opened today on the Day of Slavic Writing and Culture, celebrated on May the 24th. This year we celebrate the 1160th anniversary of the emergence of Slavonic script, and this event is a good reminder of the cultural, historical and civilizational community of the Slavic peoples and the brotherly ties stretching back to many centuries ago, which we are confident will withstand the various attempts to spread neoliberal values and ideology which are alien to us. Our task is to strengthen our efforts to promote and protect the Russian language from any forms of discrimination, and we apply the same standards to everyone, not only to us and the Russian language, but also to any and all languages. And it is our principled stance. However, we see the destructive trends that are visible against the Russian language. We have seen a company which has been years in the making to discriminate against the Russian language. I don't think anyone can truly hope that one day the Russian language will disappear, but the discrimination campaign by the West is massive. The forum is organized for the third time this year. It's supported by the Ministry of Science and Higher Education under the auspices of the Commission of the Russian Federation for UNESCO and dedicated to the Year of the Russian Language as a language of international communication in the CIS space. Russian and foreign philologists, linguists, writers, journalists, teachers, representatives of state bodies, professional and public associations, and business structures will discuss the problems of promoting the Russian language abroad, the development of modern Russian literature and Russian language education, as well as other vital issues of Russian studies. During the forum, Pushkin Institute experts will present the updated index of the Russian language in the world for 2023. They will hold a panel discussion on the status of the Russian language in the CIS countries, the problems of language culture nexus, the role of teachers in the scientific and creative life, the traditional scientific conference, Cyril and Methodius readings, and other events. On the eve of the 225th anniversary of poet Alexander Pushkin, a roundtable on his works and the problems of modern Pushkin studies will be held. A detailed program of the forum is available on its website. The website also features broadcasts of its events. The link will be available. Tomorrow, on May the 25th, is Africa Day, the holiday symbolizing the unity and victory of African peoples in their struggle for national independence and building a new life. On this day in 1963, 60 years ago, the formation of the Organization of African Unity was announced. It marked the beginning of the continent's progressive movement towards political and economic integration. Today, the African Union is the successor in this endeavor, working to forge collective approaches to peace and security, democratic processes, human development, and social and economic growth. Russia and Africa share traditional ties of friendship, and it is emblematic that on this anniversary year we are holding the second Russia-Africa Summit. The Russian-African Summit meeting, scheduled to take place in St. Petersburg in July, will be the pinnacle of Russian-African foreign policy relations and will give a new impetus to the whole range of our relations with the African countries in the long run. Western powers not only continue to exploit the African peoples by siphoning off resources and counting the profits for their corporations, they also clean up their own past. The falsification of history is not uncommon. It's not only about rewriting the outcomes of the Second World War, but also about a cynical campaign to silence the horrors of the colonial era. The West is trying to pretend that the suffering of many generations of Africans, including racism, slave trade, murder, and punitive operations, have nothing to do with them. Instead, they choose flash mob events which are supposed to show how the white people care about the colored population, but in fact these are just flash mobs which do not feature any true understanding of how nefarious this approach is. The ideology of garden versus jungle is only gaining momentum. They try to pretend that all of this that happened in the colonial era did not actually happen. Did it or did it not? But Africa remembers, and it remembers those who truly helped them in their fight for liberation. Because it's not just about liberating the countries and peoples of the continent. The very notion of colonialism, the very phenomenon, is shameful. In the run-up to and during Africa Day itself, the Russian Foreign Ministry and Russian diplomatic missions in Africa are publishing articles on the history of the colonial struggle on their social media. These articles also tell about Russia's substantial contribution to the liberation and establishment of these countries, how we continue to be friends, cooperate, and engage on the basis of equality and mutual benefit. Tomorrow, we will also present a small surprise, a gift. One can probably say so. Follow our social media. I think you're going to like it. On the 25th of May, we also celebrate the 30th anniversary of the fundamental Russia-Tajikistan document, the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Mutual Assistance between the Russian Federation and the Republic of Tajikistan, signed on May the 25th, 1993. Since the first day of independence, Tajikistan has been a strategic partner and ally of Russia. Russia has always been near Tajikistan by its side and provided any and all possible assistance to the Republic, including in difficult periods of history. Right now, Tajikistan is supporting us in our difficult geopolitical situation, and this is an example of genuine friendship. During this short period, in terms of history, we have done a lot of work to build a qualitatively new model of international relations. It meets the national interests of both states, helps improve the well-being and quality of life of our citizens, sustainable social and economic development, strengthening the competitiveness of national economies, rational use of labor resources, and a fuller untapping of human potential, including at various tracks. We cherish our historic traditions of friendship and mutual understanding, spiritual and cultural communication of our two people. We are looking forward to see what the future will be like, but we cherish our past. Active, substantive, and open dialogue at the highest levels allow us to solve urgent issues of bilateral relations and find mutually acceptable solutions to international problems. Our countries have built a substantial legal and treaty base of relations, more than 200 interstate, intergovernmental, and interdepartmental agreements regulating the issues of cooperation in a wide range of bilateral interaction in politics, economics, military, culture, humanitarian sphere, and other fields have been signed. Trade and economic ties show a stable dynamics. Russia has traditionally been one of Tajikistan's leading trade partners. Our relations in trade and economy are equal and mutually beneficial, despite the Western countries' attempts to impose illegitimate restrictive measures on third countries pursuing an independent foreign policy, something we are going to cover in more detail today. We congratulate the people of Tajikistan on this auspicious day and wish them well-being and prosperity and every success. Another announcement: on the 25th and the 26th of May, St. Petersburg will host the 21st International Likhachev Scientific Readings, held in accordance with the presidential decree on commemorating Dmitry Likhachev, dated May the 23rd, 2001. They were co-founded by the Russian Academy of Sciences, the Russian Academy of Education, the Congress of St. Petersburg Intellectuals. Likhachev readings are traditionally supported by our ministry. Over the past years, they have been attended by representatives of 57 countries. There is also a diplomatic program called International Dialogue of Cultures, where more than 50 ambassadors and consuls general from different countries have already presented their views on major problems on international development. This year's topic is Dialects and Conflicts of Cultures in a Changing World. It is expected to bring together leading Russian and foreign scholars, politicians, diplomats, and public figures. Another important date, and here it's not just about the date, it's about the topic. This year, on May the 29th, is the first time the Eurasian Economic Union Day is celebrated, coinciding with the date of signing the EA-EU Treaty, which happened on May the 29th in 2014. Over the years of the EA-EU's existence, its member states, namely Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia, have achieved significant results on the path of integration. The internal market is functioning and evolving, the geography of international contacts is expanding, and mutual trade between the 5 countries is showing steady growth. The EA-EU states deepen and strengthen their mutually beneficial cooperation in trade, industrial cooperation, the development of transport and logistics, energy and food security. The Union's international agenda is actively development. Free trade agreements with Vietnam and Serbia, an interim agreement leading to a free trade zone with Iran, and 2 non-preferential trade agreements with China have been signed and entered into force since 2014. Currently, the full-fledged free trade agreement with Iran has reached its final stage. 5 rounds of negotiations on a free trade agreement with Egypt have been held. Negotiations with Indonesia and the UAE have been launched. At the same time, the Eurasian Economic Commission, the supranational body of the EAEU, has concluded more than 80 memorandums of cooperation and mutual understanding with the governments of third countries and national organizations and integration associations. Our heartfelt congratulations on the forthcoming EAEU Day. We thank our partners for these successful 9 years, and we are confident in further constructive work for the benefit of Eurasian integration. On the very same day, we also celebrate the International Day of Peacekeepers. On May the 29th, the UN and the entire world community celebrate this day. Exactly 75 years ago, the UN Security Council established the world's first and still existing peacekeeping operation, the UN Truce Supervision Organization, to help end hostilities in Palestine. This day, established by the UNGA in 2002, serves as a reminder about the self-sacrificing feat of those who made the ultimate sacrifice in the name of peace. Unfortunately, similar tragedies occur even today. Last year, Lieutenant Colonel Alexei Mazura, head of the Russian team of UN military observers, was killed in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He will be awarded the Medal of Dag Hammarskjöld. Peacekeeping activities is why peacekeepers, including Russian ones, managed to put an end to conflicts and restore stability in dozens of countries suffering bloodshed and destruction. We attach particular importance to the UN peacekeeping activities. As a UNSC permanent member, Russia actively develops mandates of UN operations on peacekeeping, instructing the missions to be respectful in their relations with the host country. We are one of the greatest contributors to the UN peacekeeping budget, and it says military observers and policemen to Middle East, to Africa, Latin America, and Europe. As of March the 31st, 2023, there are 79 Russians, including 13 women, serving in UN peacekeeping missions. We attach great importance to training women peacekeepers. In particular, the Russian National Peacekeeping Training Center under the Russian Ministry of the Interior, located in Domodedovo, offers UN-certified training for foreign law enforcement officers, and a large number of them are women. Moving on to questions. Do we have International Life with us? Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, has said that the UN does not reflect the existing realities of the world, and the organization needs reform. Let me quote Prime Minister Modi. "It is a matter of analysis. Why do we have to talk about peace and stability in different forums? Why is the UN, which was started with the idea of establishing peace, not successful in preventing conflicts today? Why even the definition of terrorism has not been accepted in the UN? If one introspects, one thing is clear: the institutions created in the last century are not in line with the system of the 21st century. What's the MFA's take on the need to reform the UN? Are there any specific proposals on such a reform?" We share the Indian Prime Minister's idea about the need to adapt this universal organization to today's reality. Any changes must be well thought out and be a product of substantive negotiations among member states and respect the so-called division of labors among the key bodies of the organization enshrined in its charter. The UN's pillar has always been its intergovernmental nature. Attempts to equalize member states and non-state actors, including NGOs, are fraught with the danger to undermine today's modern architecture of international relations, because it's the states who are responsible for respecting the decisions adopted at the UN. Unfortunately, the UN has not always been capable of preventing conflicts, because its efficiency depends on the political will of its members and their readiness to compromise in order to find collective solutions. Let me give you a quote. The Minsk agreements that were elaborated and brought to the table of the UN Security Council, after which they became part of a UNSC resolution which is legally binding that all states of the world must comply with. What happened next? We saw lies in the initial design of those who signed these agreements in the West. We have seen the implementation of this resolution torpedoed by Kiev and its handlers in the West. Can one say that the Security Council is inefficient? Who is inefficient? The people who adopt a very correct document, find compromise, find common ground, or is it those who don't want to implement them, respect them, and salute its adoption without actually intending to respect their obligations and block their implementation? One needs to differentiate. We are convinced that the UNSC reform with increased role of developing countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America in global affairs will be conducive to a more just world order and will strengthen international peace and security. We particularly think about India and Brazil, who are natural candidates for a permanent seat in the Security Council if a decision is made to increase the number of both types of seats. We also think it's essential to remedy the historic injustice against the African continent in the parameters agreed upon by Africans themselves. Naturally, the number of Western countries is already too high, and there is no need to increase it any further, because they are not overrepresented only in numbers. There is an interesting idea, because the EU is conducting a joint foreign policy. On the international arena, it only offers the position that was agreed upon among EU countries, and it's mandatory for its member states to implement.
And there is no... And the decisions adopted by the EU campers on global issues are voted on the UN platform in the so-called unity. And they state that are in solidarity and then vote on for example, on the UN General Assembly resolution having worked a collective position. But the problem is the position is not collective, but elaborated by those bureaucratic mechanisms and then informed. But how is it legally substantiated and just that in the UN Security Council there are Western states representing permanent members and non-permanent members who have a unified foreign policy? They have one vote each, and they act not in solidarity, not in with solidary position, but with the positions elaborated for them by their collective decision-making bodies. It's an interesting issue. They have one policy, always one policy, but there are many arms raised for voting. So they allegedly demonstrate the support of their position, but it's not multiply supported position. It's one position. It's just one single position. So no one is encouraged. No one of them is allowed to have some separate position. Even within the EU, we observe what happens to those who try to implement their own domestic policy. We see restrictions imposed on them in order to make them obey the disciplinary dominance of Brussels. And the ambitions of Germany and Japan to become permanent members are seen as absolutely unsubstantiated, and I have spoken about the reasons. Regarding the EU head of diplomacy, Josep Borrell, he has recently stated the necessity to grow military assistance to Ukraine on the outcome of the meeting of the EU Foreign Affairs Council on the 22nd of May. How does this call correlate with his calls for peace? I do not even remember his calls for peace. Maybe those were some theoretical statements. We see the conflict in acute phase in Ukraine, and we hear that Borrell talking about everything to be decided on the battlefield, no time for negotiations, for discussing some peaceful initiatives. We see that he's talking about that. What calls for peace are you talking about? If there have been some calls for peace, they are immediately covered by his calls to ship more arms, to support the Kiev regime. They even do not talk about democracy and freedom. Their point of view, their ideology, and their mentality should win according to them. Otherwise, as they say, they will not survive. It's nearly a direct citation of Borrell. What you are talking about, he made that comment on the sidelines of the EU defense meeting. It took place on the 22nd, 23rd of May in Brussels. It's about the approach of the European Union based on the political situation. And those belligerent statements by the EU head of diplomacy are contrary to the core interests of the European citizens, just common citizens, and their political leaders just made them participate in the conflict in Ukraine. They are making them supporters of the Kiev Nazi regime. The moral and ethical degradation of the EU diplomacy, I think it is obvious when the diplomacy representative is demanding to resolve the situation on the battlefield and leaves no place for diplomacy where it is obviously a dysfunction, a complete dysfunction. And the picture imposed by Josep Borrell is supplying increased supplies of arms to Ukraine, military systems, and now aircraft. It was presented as an attempt to keep people alive. There is no other example of a military conflict where Brussels would have such a perverted logic. And they justify everything with human rights. What human rights and what human? They are not even mentioning it now. So it's obvious that Brussels is guided by the current situation, by inflicting a strategic defeat on our country, ensuring the dominance of the West in Europe and in the world as a whole. For 3.5 years, in Brussels is guided by the current situation, by inflicting a strategic defeat on our country, ensuring the dominance of the West in Europe and in the world as a whole. For 3.5 years, in his position, Borrell I think not only discredited himself, but has discredited this position itself. Nearly nothing remains of true diplomacy in his work, and he admits that himself, rejoicing in his new role of the Minister of Defense of the European Union. But you understand what is meant. He confirms his responsibility, though implicitly, that for supplying heavy arms to Ukraine by the EU. he has actually become, if not ideologist, but a supporter of the policy of confrontation, and continues to prolong the hostilities in Ukraine, and is considering the geopolitical mistakes, the grave mistakes committed by the European Union, and the criminal activities that the EU representatives with Washington have been conducting on the territory of Ukraine for the latest years, participation in coup d'etat, modeling domestic policy of a sovereign state in accordance with their interests, alternative demands, to forget the economic ties with neighbors, and to reshape the country on the basis of the ideas of the European Union. It's a criminal logic that led to the current situation, and a flow of misinformation from him continues. Just consider the statements of Borrell that Ukraine did not participate in the NATO plans of enlargement. In 2008, in Bucharest, it is written in the declaration of the NATO summit is written that Ukraine and Georgia will become NATO members, but there is a detail. Maybe he meant that when they wrote that in 2008, they did not consider such actions with regard to those countries and were deceiving those countries. So there is no other options. Either he's misinforming now, or they were engaged in political intrigues, not intrigues but crimes, during all that period. The statements by Borrell not only his personal point of view, the militarization, the transformation of military and economic American global dictate. And it is obvious that the EU is comfortable with such patronizing of the United States. Maybe now it is comfortable, but they still consider such a situation profitable for them. And they're not ready to admit the fact of multipolar world where other power centers should also be considered, where the sovereignty of other peoples should be respected, the peculiarities of social, economic, cultural developments should also be considered. In the EU and in the West as a whole, they have accustomed to building their welfare on colonial forms of interaction. That's just colonial forms and taking out everything that is necessary. And that colonial logic was in place in the European Union before the military operation. There were 4 main points regarding Russia. They were completely unrealistic, and the same logics, just colonial logics of taking away everything without any further, I don't know, duties or equal rights. It has been long forgotten. And that is why the European Union stands for preserving the Western status quo, divides the world into jungle and garden, and acting, as they say, to the benefit of our 1 billion citizens. It has been written in the joint EU-NATO declaration of the 10th of January this year. Nothing has been invented, everything is from their documents. So there can be no trust towards such a European Union that has lost its political subjectivity and acting in accordance with the interests of others and not in accordance with their own people. not respecting the sovereignty of countries. No trust can be there. And the European Union is unlikely to act as some honest broker in some settlement, in some mediatorship in Transcaucasia, Western Balkans, Africa, Asia, Latin America, and wherever. And the independent role of the EU is just on paper. It has been declarative and not implemented. My next question. In May, it is a year from the launch of the project to import the Ukrainian agricultural products, the so-called solidarity corridors. And the volumes of shipments to the years of grain from Ukraine, in comparison with 2021, grew to 960%. And the growth of Ukrainian agricultural products amounted to 88%. So this taking out of agricultural products from Ukraine to the benefit of the European Union. How does it correlate with their statements on ensuring agricultural security for those states who are in need? So that's just declarative care for the others. We have all heard those appeals. It's a known trick of Brussels to attract the attention of global community and to promote their so-called EU humanitarian initiatives. And what you have mentioned, that EU project, is one more vivid example. Let us go to the facts. From the very beginning, those corridors were presented as ensuring interests of the countries of the global south. What do we see now as the time has passed? For the year of these initiatives, the markets of the regions bordering with Ukraine, Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, became saturated with agricultural products from Ukraine. And in April this year, they admitted that they suffered from a surplus of the Ukrainian products. It's really a wild thing, but it's a fact. And so they took extreme measures. They unilaterally prohibited the import, in some cases even transit, of the grain and other agricultural products from Ukraine. So, to put it simply, they just cared about the countries in need in Africa and Asia. They bought so many products, they just destroyed their own markets. So, it's just a direct course of actions. It's not some compilation. So the European Commission was openly requested to protect the markets from a lot of cheap and not always quality agricultural products, because the experts, the security experts, found in the Ukrainian grains 22 chemical substances prohibited in the EU, including pesticides, GMO, and so on. So it's a classical phrase from the American film, just someone save me. So it's the same thing. It's just a desire to gain some benefits from others and then protecting themselves from themselves. And during a meeting of the EU Agricultural Council on the 25th of April, they offered to buy jointly the Ukrainian agricultural products in order to guarantee they get into the countries most in need. And just A whole year has passed when they remembered for whom that project was developed, and they just had to remember it when they destroyed their own agricultural producers. And it was not themselves overcoming the crisis they have caused themselves. They just need external aid, now the assistance of the UN. I would like to draw special attention to this project, to go back to the very beginning, as the launch of the corridors was launched with additional measures to liberalize Ukrainian exports into the EU, abolishing the customs rates and stopping the use of systems of imported prices and the tariff quotas that facilitated the access of products to the EU markets and not the developing countries' markets. So everything has been revealed after a year that just a dishonest plan, and very indicative are the data on the participants of the specialized IT platform to search for business partners in order to import the agricultural products through the corridors. And around 1,000 companies are registered on the platform, and 90%, even more than 90%, are EU members or companies from Ukraine. Only 4 companies from African countries, Botswana, Nigeria and South Africa. What other proof is needed? Why all that has been developed? And it's not a considerable amount of assistance to Ukrainian farmers, including to a statement by Mr. Dmitry, Deputy Agriculture Minister of Ukraine. 90% of Ukrainian agricultural companies bear losses. And the EU continues to highlight the importance of shipping agricultural products exclusively from the territory of Ukraine, and ignores the difficulties of access of Russian agricultural products to global markets. So they just buy the Ukrainian goods regardless of their destination point. And Brussels continues to promote solidarity corridors despite the obvious losses and complaints by their own citizens. It should be noted that the Ukrainian agricultural products have long become de facto not Ukrainian, as the lands are controlled by the EU and transnational agricultural business and the Western loan and financial institutions. The Euro Commission legalizing temporary unilateral measures to prohibit the import of Ukrainian agricultural products to the EU markets by guaranteeing the free flow on the territory of other EU countries is just another indicator why those corridors exist and have been organized.
Apparently, not everyone has stocked up on Ukrainian grain, whether it's about countries in the EU or somewhere else in the West or somewhere related to the aforementioned Western handlers. Another curious fact. A significant share of the Ukrainian grain in Western European countries goes to be used as forage. They cared so much about developing countries in need of food that they overstocked on grain and are now feeding this grain to cattle. Imagine that. The EU's dependence on the import of forage crops is a well-known fact. According to the Science and Research Service of the European Parliament, over 50% of the Ukrainian export of corn, which is an important forage culture, accounts for the EU. The EU is trying to stock on grain at the expense of the states that are very vulnerable and depend on the supply of grain. This entire situation once again shows that the West is ready to use counterfeit goals and purposes, as well as deceitful narratives, to damage international food security, shifting the blame for this to Russia or anyone else, just not to be held accountable for this. Do you have Russia Today present here? Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. My first question. Can you please comment on the visit of Milorad Dodik, the president of the Republika Srpska, to Moscow, given the West's pressure to stop contacts between Serbian leaders from the Republika Srpska and Russia? What kind of assistance can the Republika Srpska expect from Russia? Your question sounds like you're unfamiliar with our activities, because we have told so much about our assistance to the Republika Srpska and our relations in general. We know how many efforts the West is making to pressure other countries to stop cooperating with Russia. The level of this pressure is unprecedented. Unprecedented historically, because today this kind of pressure is being exerted against many countries. But I think it is unprecedented in history. Blackmail, sanctions, and other tools are employed by the Europeans, and all the more valuable to us are the efforts of the Republika Srpska, and our partnership is becoming increasingly strategic. We think that improving the ties between our two countries is fully in line with the interests of our two peoples and is not against someone. There are those who we think want to damage us, but their efforts are not going to bring any results. They fell so low that they can only dream of getting back to their former high position. And the efforts of those who follow the neo-colonial approach will not prevent Russia and the Republika Srpska to develop their cooperation and strengthen stability, security, and peace in the Balkans in accordance with the existing international law. My second question. What does Moscow think about the agreement between Belgrade and Budapest on the construction of an oil pipeline, considering that it will indirectly link Serbia and Russia? This initiative will increase access to Russian energy amid the ideology-driven sanction war unleashed by the bureaucrats from Brussels. This war is hitting Europe hard. And every day it damages the EU a lot. We consider this project to be an example of certain countries' reasonable desire to be guided first and foremost by their own interests, as well as their economic needs and the needs of their citizens without damaging anyone else. Russia fully respects the sovereign country of all states to develop their energy infrastructure, including transborder one. You know that we are a responsible exporter of energy to world markets. We are ready to supply energy to anyone who is interested for just market prices. Serbia is a friendly country. We are interested in strengthening its energy security. My final question. In Serbia, namely in Kosovo and Metohija and nearby, the NATO exercise Defender Europe 2023 started. What's the purpose of this exercise? What kind of signal does it send to Serbia, considering that Kosovo Albanians are going to participate? NATO's activities in the Balkans are aimed at damaging the international law and the countries of the region. It has nothing to do with NATO-declared democracy values and freedom values. Under the veneer of deceitful claims about strengthening regional security, the US and its allies further damages the already fragile stability in this part of Europe, deepen the divide, and send the population on a downward spiral of nervousness in light of the threats coming from the outside. Choosing Kosovo, the main tension hotbed in the Balkans, as the place for this exercise, once again confirms that it's not just an anti-Serbian provocation, it's also an act of subversion against the fundamental pillars of Kosovo settlements. Militarization of this region and training the so-called security force with a view to transform them into a full-fledged army is a crude violation of the UNSC Resolution 1244, which only allows international presence in this territory to ensure security. One such presence is the multinational Kosovo force deployed in 1991, whose mandate does not provide for increasing Pristina's military capacity. That is all. Thank you. Do we have RTVI present today? Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. Just one question. On the 22nd of May, Antonio Tajani, head of the Italian Foreign Ministry, said that the preparation of anti-Russian sanctions will take some time. Do you expect any new sanctions anytime soon? What will Moscow do if the EU adopts such new sanctions? This is what I call biting the hand that feeds you. And apparently it takes some fantasy. They are running out of ideas to damage themselves. No matter how much they limit their ability to cooperate with our country, no matter how delusional they are about being able to destroy Russia's economy. According to Obama, our economy is already in tatters and has been for 10 years. Apparently, they are now out of ideas to finally destroy our economy. Absurdity, insanity, common silliness, call it what you like, but no matter how hard they try to do this, it will change nothing for Russia. We have adapted to the new reality. There are numbers that show this. The EU has already recognized that their range of tools of exerting pressure against Russia has already reached its limit, and they recognize that their declared goal of collapsing Russian economy and bringing about political destabilization, now they recognize that they damaged themselves. Our economy has withstood the pressure, and they can only find more loans and other economic benefits in relation to the current crisis. Apparently, those who are brave enough to raise their voice and defend their rights say directly that these restrictions damage the EU's economy more than they damage Russia. You have heard the Russian government and Russian economists. These have said that our economy is back on track, inflation is at an all-time low, and We have rebuilt our foreign economy ties. It has strengthened our economic sovereignty. It doesn't mean we have no problems whatsoever. It's just we don't feel this insanity that the West is increasing. It is the current reality, but we have managed to overcome it. The EU has now seen that they damaged their own interests first and foremost, and it is clear that they are looking for a way out. I have a feeling that after this blunder of their politics in sanctions, they just want to take it out on third countries. Apparently, the EU is going to focus on secondary sanctions against the countries who refuse to follow the EU's dictate when it comes to respecting their unilateral restrictive measures. It's just a pretext. I have a feeling that they just want to set up their control indicators all over the world and use the pretext of acting against Russia, but in fact, they are going to spread the net of control to the regions that they have no authority over, that they are not supposed to dominate. It's the same logic, a beautiful garden versus wild jungle. Some are living at the expense of the others. The golden billion is owed everything, and the rest must just serve any follies of the golden billion. It's about disrespecting the sovereign interests of other countries. The Western sanctions against Russia are illegitimate, illegal. They were adopted without any participation of the UN Security Council, and the extraterritorial limitations are doubly illegitimate because here we see a hybrid hit on the international law, and this arrogance by the EU will only push other countries away from it and will strengthen the trend for shaping a multipolar world. You probably know, we have already seen this before, Russia will provide a balanced response to these new restrictive measures, will increase its cooperation with reliable partners despite any restrictions and blackmail by the West. Thank you. Do we have the Chinese Media Corporation present today? Good afternoon. Just one question today. The Prime Minister of Russia, Mikhail Mishustin, is currently visiting China on the invitation of the Chinese Prime Minister. This visit provides for many events, including the Russia-China Business Forum in Shanghai. What does Russia expect from this trip? What does Moscow think about its cooperation with China in trade and economics? A lot has been said before this visit and during this visit. The Russian Prime Minister, Mr. Mishustin, spoke in front of the Chinese audience and described the goals and purposes of this visit. This visit is multifaceted. Our relations are dynamically developing. The heads of state held negotiations as part of the first overseas visit of the Chinese president after his re-election. A new high-level contact is currently underway, the Russian Prime Minister's official visit to China. In order to participate in the Russia-China Business Forum, a large delegation comprising heads of Russian national organizations and businesses, about 1,500 Russian and Chinese participants have exchanged their ideas and established business contacts. In the near future, we will see positive results of this forum. The prime ministers have attached great importance to the implementation of agreements made by the presidents in promoting our ties. They will focus on bringing the practical cooperation to a qualitatively new level, including in energy, transport, finance, agriculture, science, and technologies. The high intensity of Russian-Chinese political contacts coincides with the rapid acceleration of our trade and economic cooperation. Our trade turnover has been growing by a third for many years, and in 2022 it has amounted 185 billion US dollars. Russia has become China's number 7 partner in economy, and we intend to implement the heads of state instruction to bring our trade figures to the level indicated in these agreements. Thank you. Do we have Open TV from Greece present today? Yes, we are here. Madam Zakharova, first, let me congratulate you and all Slavs on the Day of Slavic Writing and Culture. We are disputing with Bulgaria who is who, but Cyril and Methodius are saints, and may them help us. We have heard in Greek media that Russia might try to interfere with Greek elections, that Russia has done something to that effect. In the run-up to the new elections that are due to take place on the 25th of June, are we going to try something? Is Moscow interested in the Greek elections? On a more serious note, who do you want to emerge as a victor, and what kind of relations does Russia currently have with Greece? Russia's interference with someone else's elections has already become a commonplace idea that certain politicians use to improve their ratings and get some extra points in the voters' eyes. We've heard so many stories about Russia's alleged interference, but in the end of the day, we either had not seen any facts corroborating these allegations, or such claims were refuted. If you're going to report about these to your audience, you should probably focus on the number of accusations. And recently, the US has refuted such claims when there was a race between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Before, during, and after the elections, and over those 4 years of Trump's presidency, there was a lot of talk about Russia's participation, interference, and influence over the electoral cycles and the US president's foreign policy. A report has been published. Probably Russia influenced that report as well. And that report left no doubt that those were fakes and someone's fantasies. That was my first point. Second, we always implement the policy of non-interference in domestic affairs of sovereign states. We are able of cooperating and interacting with other countries, providing assistance and support, developing contacts. It's all part of our range of tools, and Greece has probably experienced all of that. But whether it counts as interference, I don't think that this question should be asked to us. Your region is well aware who typically meddles in someone else's elections. You also asked whether we have any interest about what's going on in Greece. Naturally, we closely follow the processes in other countries, including the electoral processes. It is part of a state's normal functioning. We respect voters' choice, no matter whom they choose. We are open to dialogue, and we are ready to cooperate with all constructive forces. As for the parliamentary elections in Greece, we have seen the outcomes, we have taken them into account, and we need to point out that the once traditionally friendly relations between Russia and Greece are currently in a deep crisis. The reasons are well known. We have spoken a lot about that. These reasons did not originate with us. We see no interest from Athens in cooperation with Russia. And let me remind you that Greece was the one who dismantled this cooperation. Thank you for sovereign states. Excuse me, what? Sovereign states. Thank you for your words. Can I ask you another question about another election in Turkey? You see that certain people in Cyprus and certain people in the international arena express cautious optimism that after these elections, negotiations might be restarted on the Cyprus issue. Is Russia interested in such a development? Is Russia going to assist in this process, especially given that you have very developed relations with Ankara and your traditional role in the settlement on the island?
I think it would be good from your newspaper to precise why our relations with Greece are not so on such a high level, and who is to blame for that. We have repeatedly highlighted on the regulation of the Cyprus issue. We act within the international framework with regard to the Security Council resolutions, and we think that the inhabitants of the island should not be have some schedules imposed on them, and there should be no pressure, and interests and fair concerns of the two communities should be taken into account. That should be the basis. We have productive interaction with Turkey on a whole range of issues, and the Cyprus issue is also where we interact. Is Anadolu with us? Yes, hello, Madam Zakharova. We have 4 questions today. Could you comment on the statement by the U.S. Department of State on Wagner private military company trying to acquire the arms of foreign production through Mali in order to use them in Ukraine? So it's the same statement as saying they are buying arms from the American private military company Blackwaters. There is nothing even to comment here. So the Department of State, I think, instead of those misinformations, should deal on the issue of weapons, the weapon supplies to the region under the pretext of aid to the Kiev regime. But it goes on not only to the European continent and the EU companies, but are also transported to other continents. Instead of irresponsibly saying those words, the Department of State should bring to responsibility, should be brought to responsibility with regard to how the EU can account for spreading weapons all over the world under the pretext of assistance to Kiev regime. Do they have any data on that? How can they comment on that? Do they have some responsibility for that? And so on and so on. Also, the EU, the United States of America are considering the shipments of fighter jets to Ukraine. Could you comment on that issue as well? Our high-ranking representatives have already commented on that issue. It's just another stage of the conflict escalation and destabilization of the situation on the European continent. And the consequences have just not been considered by the Western partners, the EU countries. They are acting in accordance with the American interests and do not have the idea how those experiments can end. Another question, the Armenian officials have repeatedly criticized Russia on the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And according to those statements, Yerevan is to increase its cooperation with the West and limit its cooperation with Russia and the CSTO. Does Russia consider the scenario when they will have to leave the military base in Armenia in order to pass it on to the Western forces? While considering every situation and using all the instruments in order to resolve the situation on the ground politically, there have been negotiations in Moscow with Armenian and Azerbaijani foreign ministers, and it's what we work on in several areas, in several spheres. As you know, there are Russian peacekeepers were there, and I would like to say the same thing regarding the Collective Security Treaty Organization. This organization has its own speakers. We participate in that treaty, and we consider this organization highly effective, and it has proved its efficiency. So our estimation is that, but every party has the right to estimate. So one more question. Recently there has been a demonstration in Chisinau, and the pro-European citizens expressed their willingness to become EU members, and the special military operation of Russia in Transnistria conflict has been condemned. Do you have some comments on that? If you're talking about the demonstration on the 25th of May, in parallel with Chisinau, there have been demonstrations in other Moldovan towns, and they were attended by many people. And the demonstration you have mentioned in the Chisinau, with the so-called European perspectives of Moldova, they just declared, I think, twice the number of participants that actually participated there. So regarding the alternative demonstrations with people for continuing cooperation with our country, no one just added the number of participants there. We see the same logics that is wild and detrimental, not the logics of cooperation for the interest of the people of Moldova that would be brought by cooperation with Russia, with the European Union and other integration bodies and platforms, but some logics that comes even to blackmail, that does not consider any alternative or harmonization of approaches. It's not the first time. Is it some distant past? No, it's just modern realities that have repeatedly been presenting an opportunity to learn from others' mistakes. But unfortunately, someone who uses these logics considers it right to study those lessons separately without any conclusions or some analytical learnings from the mistakes of others. And the logics in situation with these countries with complex history, complex situation, that have not formed as stable with a long history, sovereign states, sovereign and autonomous states. They have a long history of conflicts that aggravates the situation in their territory. This logics usually leads to catastrophic consequences. I do not predict, I do not deal with that. I just compare the historical experience and facts with the reality and make conclusions. This logic just strikes the people of Moldova, where in such an ultimatum it is said that a choice will be made. Otherwise, no one explains what will happen. No one explains with facts, with numbers. It is only through intimidation, through threats, through anti-populational decisions, renaming a language, persecuting those who have been connected for the entire life with Russia by some good neighborly relationship ties. It's detrimental logics. It's just another example. The Moldovan citizens are experiencing more and more the difference of what is promised by the authorities and the real situation. The real situation is a continual degradation of social, economic situation in the country. They are promised to live as in Europe. They are talked about European values, and if we consider that today pro-NATO European values, they are pushed towards them. It's a lack of freedom of expression, the impossibility to realize their democratic rights is just being dictated by the so-called liberal ideology. But they have not been informed about those details, that it is included into the European values. They were talked about freedom, democracy, democratic institutions on which the state should be built on, but now they get the contrary. And the Moldovan citizens see that the government does not consider their opinion. In modern history, yes, we can consider Germany in the 30s, the 40s, when they changed the fonts and said that the fonts should be ideologically right. But in order for people to be presented the fact that they will not speak their own mother tongue, but their mother tongue will be called in a different way, it can just be compared to the territory of Ukraine. But their situation was still different. Just in one day takes a decision that now the language is not Moldovan but the Romanian. I do not know such examples. So there's Gagauzia autonomy, elections there, and there are many examples. And there is this mass discontent and a widespread protest in Moldova for that reason. So it is just justified by some hybrid war against Russia. And we call on the authorities not to justify their lack of success with confrontation with Russia. And in contrast to the Western countries, Russia does not interfere into the domestic affairs of other countries. And we call on the Moldovan government to consider all the opinions of the population of the country and avoid the politicization of the social life of the republic. And that's what I would like to mention. Do you have any other questions? No? Thank you very much. Thank you. Is News.ru with us? Yes, hello, News.ru. The first question, how does the foreign ministry estimate the statement by Mr. Pashinyan on the readiness to admit Karabakh, part of Azerbaijan, before the trilateral meeting in Moscow? Does it increase the chances of signing a peace agreement? So, firstly, it's the prerogative of Armenia and its people. Such statements are the prerogative of Armenia. And I just see this question as a mediatorship of Russia in that conflict. And we need to have clear position of the state, particularly Armenia, on that topic. It's a multi-year conflict, and the mediatorship efforts provided through international structures and by regional countries, and of course for moving on with regard to the documents signed, we need to understand the clear position of states on that account. So we consider the Armenian Prime Minister's statement as a confirmation of the position during the Prague Summit on the 7th of October 2022. It has a reference to the Alma-Ata Declaration of 1991, where the administrative borders between the former USSR republics are admitted as interstate borders. As we have repeatedly said, the Prague Agreement has given a new qualitative framework to the negotiations process between Baku and Yerevan. And I would like to highlight that the EU also participated there, and the latest statements by Nikola Pashinyan caused a controversial action in Armenia itself, in Nagorno-Karabakh. It's just in the context of internal political polemics. I just mentioned it, but still, regarding the peaceful treaty draft, the Armenia and Azerbaijan foreign ministers met in Moscow, and it allowed to improve the negotiations on their common position on the whole range of issues, and Mr. Lavrov has already made a statement on that. Next question regarding the U.S. Department of State's threatening sanctions to Georgia following the renewal of air transportation, and what's the reaction to protests near the parliament and the airport buildings? So I think that there should be no interference into the internal affairs of states. So it's not just the countries who are neighbors geographically, but we have many connections historically. And why should the US be mentioned here? It's unclear. Just there is no understanding or no explanation why the US consider it appropriate to comment on the agreements of two sovereign states. The second point here is the third time I mention it today. If the US considers human rights as the basis of its policy, they should stem from human rights in this situation. And there is nothing more complicated than crossing the border of the two countries that have had very close connections, also relationship through relations, humanitarian connections. It is really difficult without direct air transportation. People, it came from people. They had made statements, sent letters, made requests for many years. And no PR campaign could just keep that issue going without the real desire of people for those direct flights. And the next, what I have already mentioned, someone I know very well.
This person lives both in Georgia and in Russia, and she said it was unclear why the US has no questions about Russia's flights to and from other nearby countries, but it has an axe to grind with Georgia doing the same. The US is not nervous about our flights to and from Azerbaijan. What's different about Georgia is a discrimination against Georgia as compared to other Caucasus countries. This is simply absurd. The main point that I would like to highlight once again, after the pandemic, when people faced difficulties in transportation, it became clear how essential it is to have direct contacts and how much more difficult people's life becomes when logistic chains get disrupted. Such mentorial statements by Washington are an example of blatant pressure. I suppose you wanted to learn something else. You spoke about some protests. Russia and Georgia are democratic countries. People can express their opinion. They fully have the right to do so. They need to comply with the law of their respective country, but it's up to Georgia. It organizes these processes however it sees fit. Any more questions? None from us. Do we have the Moscow Post present? We have 3 questions. The leaders of the G7 at the Hiroshima summit said that the environmental agenda did not change in connection with the new geopolitical conditions and the conflict in Ukraine and the goal to reach zero emissions of greenhouse gases no later than by 2025. What do you think about this in the context of Russia's interests? This is simply surprising. One only needs to look at the facts. Western leaders don't like to do so, and I do. When the EU countries rejected the supply of the most accessible low-emission fuel, the natural gas, they use coal with increased frequency, even though a few years ago they chose to abandon that due to environmental concerns. G7 countries bring billions of dollars to the Ukrainian conflict, maintaining the conflict, and they have yet to start bringing about their obligations to assign at least $100 billion to help developing countries in bringing their greenhouse emissions down. It's just like with Ukraine. They cared so much for developing countries that they got overstocked with Ukrainian grain and they don't know what to do with it, rather than feed it to their cattle. Same story here. They were so concerned about the environment that they switched from natural gas to coal, did not contribute the funds that they had promised, and another important fact, they supply depleted uranium ammunition to the region of conflict. Using depleted uranium and being concerned for the environment are supposed to be two very different things, but we hear these remarks from the same people. They are very concerned about the environment, but at the same time, in the same breath, they justify the use of depleted uranium. The people you have just quoted decided to declare the military use products to be carbon neutral. It is a sad irony. In this regard, G7 leaders' promises about zero emissions are met with skepticism here in Russia. As for our plans, in accordance with the President's decree dated November the 4th, 2020, our national goals on bringing down emissions of greenhouse gases by 2030, their level will be no higher than 70% compared to the level of 1990. It means that Russia will keep the emissions at the same level. We will compensate for the growth of emissions in other regions and countries of the world. As for carbon neutrality of the economy, we set realistic tasks and goals in accordance with our strategic purposes and goals. We will strive for a balance in emissions and absorption of greenhouse gases by 2060, and we are going to do this by introducing new technologies to increase energy efficiency and decreasing the emissions in various sectors of the economy. Second question about Moscow, Yerevan and Baku's relations. What can be done to strengthen them before the meeting of the three leaders in Moscow? All summit levels are commented by the Presidential Executive Office. Last question about the summit China-Central Asia. What do you think about the outcome of this meeting from the point of view of Russia's interests? I've spoken a lot about that today. I said a lot about our connection with China, and I would like to say that we are all for the development of equal and mutually beneficial cooperation between all members of the international community, including China and Central Asia. We see the strengthened relations between these countries in various spheres as one of the factors of supporting stability and stimulating economic growth in the region, both in the short term and in the long term. Security, stability, welfare of the countries of the region are in line with Russia's interests, China's interests, and Central Asian countries' interests. We are ready to strengthen mutual coordination in supporting Central Asian countries in strengthening their sovereignty, national development. We reject attempts to import color revolutions and external interference with the region's affairs. China's approach to cooperating with Central Asia is very unlike the US policy and the US allies' policy. They are becoming increasingly active. They try to pressure Central Asian countries. They try to do something that is not in line with the principle of non-interference into domestic affairs of sovereign states. The collective West sees engagement with Central Asia as a way to promote anti-Russian and anti-Chinese agenda. It's unacceptable. This approach is vastly different from ours. Russia is linked with Central Asian countries with privileged relations, alliance, or strategic partnership. On this track, we focus on implementing our bilateral and multilateral agreements, including within the CIS, CSTO, EAEU, SCO, and the Central Asian 5+ Russia format. Russia continues to contribute greatly to ensuring security guarantees in the region. Russia and the EAEU account for over 40% of Central Asia's trade turnover. There are thousands of joint enterprises. They generate over around 900,000 jobs. Hundreds of thousands of Central Asian citizens choose to study at Russian universities, and 68,000 of them study at places paid for by the Russian state budget. We think that this will help integrate the EAEU with the Belt and Road Initiative as part of building a greater Eurasian partnership. Thank you. Do we have ura.ru? economy and development of transport and logistics are analyzed at the highest level regularly. It's necessary to minimize the consequences of the West's illegitimate sanctions that hinder the interests of our citizens. Another issue is strengthening the cooperation of businesses from Russia and Belarus. We share the goal to create conditions that serve the interests of developing production in our two countries and eliminate our dependency on external supplies. The heads of state exchange their views on the military and political situation around the allied Union state, discuss relevant international and relevant problems, ensuring defense of Russia and Belarus, development of the military and technical cooperation. Given this substantial agenda, Russia and Belarus, just like close friends or close family, sometimes have their own issues, but we have always said, it has been said even at the highest level, and our allies from Belarus say the same. None of these problems are impossible to solve. To quote from Mr. Lukashenko himself, there is some discord, some misalignment on certain topics. This constructive and open, friendly dialogue is maintained at various levels. In the same vein, we are going to continue doing so in the future. As for this direct quote, you should probably ask Belarus about this. Thank you. Second question. Could you please comment on the remarks by the Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan? The CSTO has left or is leaving Armenia. In other words, if Armenia decides to exit the CSTO, it will be a fixation of the CSTO leaving Armenia. On a technical level, I cannot imagine how it can happen. If it's just a figure of speech in order to lobby a certain position, Armenia's wish to exit the CSTO, one should probably understand the inherent dangers of manipulating words. How the CSTO can leave Armenia? Well, we have already discussed this issue. I cannot really see what we are talking about. Understood. Thank you. Do we have Yle's radio from Finland? Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. Last week, we have heard that bank accounts of Finland's mission in Russia were frozen in Russia, and you said that it was a response to restrictions against Russian missions in Finland. Are there any negotiations underway or any discussions to settle this problem with accounts in Finland and in Russia? Negotiations can be conducted when both countries are interested in solving the issue. So far, on the part of Finland, we have only seen a desire to exacerbate the issue, to create a problem. And just await a response. So you see, exacerbating the issue and negotiations are vastly different things, and so far we have only seen Finland create a problem or exacerbate it, and we have only provided a symmetrical, mirrored response. Choose whatever words you like, it's up to you. Restrictions against Finland's mission come in response, symmetrical, mirrored response to the conditions that Russian foreign missions in Finland are operating under. I have some advice to Finnish authorities and other authorities. When you introduce restrictions against Russia, whether it be closing the accounts of our embassies, bringing down the number of our diplomatic staff, sanctions. When you announce such decisions, the Finnish audience need to hear from you that, as a rule, Russia provides a symmetric response. So don't be surprised when such restrictions are introduced against us. Then the Finnish society would not be surprised about what happens next, because response takes time, because we need to coordinate our actions between various governmental agencies. So somehow people tend to forget that it was Finland who initiated this problem. And when we adopt responses, everyone is under the impression that Russia does something destructive, while in fact we only respond to the destructive actions by the Finnish government. It would probably be correct so when the Finnish government chooses to do something destructive against Russia, when they announce this, they should probably remind their audience that Russia typically responds and is likely to do so this time. Right now, the Russian missions in Finland and Finnish missions in Russia are only capable of using their accounts in one bank of the country of state. Right now, our country has to pay to a Finnish bank a de facto prohibitive tariff of 5,000 euro for each transaction. Finnish colleagues will now feel the same. We have called upon Finland to lift these restrictions, and we have warned that we would introduce similar measures. We have done so. It wasn't our choice. We have given Finland a lot of opportunities to conduct talks, but they chose to ignore our suggestions. I reiterate, when unfriendly countries choose to introduce restrictions against Russia, they need to be clear that we will respond accordingly. We are ready to conduct a dialogue on these problems, even though they created them. Funny business, creating problems and then thinking how to solve them. Don't create them in the first place. Do we have Reuters?
Yes, hello, Madam Zakharova. My first question regarding the grain deal. On the 22nd of May, the EU spokesman for Foreign Affairs, Peter Stano, stated that the EU does not intend to introduce SWIFT for Rossellkosbank. According to him, it has no relation to the grain deal, to grain export. It's just a sanctions measure in response to Russia's actions in Ukraine. So the question is, taken into account introducing SWIFT for Rossellkosbank, it was one of the primary requirements in the grain deal. Is there some hope remaining that the Russian requirements will be met? So it's not a story of hope, of belief, of grounds, but it's a story about a different thing. Those bases, grounds, they cannot be dismantled by anyone because they have been fixed in a package agreement. They remain where they are. They just need to be implemented. We just state that no efforts by the parties have led to an effective positive result. It's what we can admit with regard to the issue you have mentioned. It's not a question of hope or belief. It's a question of implementing the agreements we have spoken about that have been fixed. And the second question, can be correlated with the first one. In particular, several years ago, a source in the Ukrainian government has informed that Ukraine will unblock the transit of Russian ammonia through the Ukrainian territory only if Russia agrees to enlarge the Ukraine deal, maybe enlarge the list of exported goods, the number of ports through which they can be exported. Does Russia consider a possibility of enlarging the format of the deal, with taking into account some guarantees to unblock the ammonia transit? I can say that Russia, during expert meetings, has repeatedly voiced the position that enlarging the categories you have mentioned, the list of goods and the number of ports, it cannot be discussed. And the last question, I would like to get your comment on the incident declared by the investigative committee a terror act in the Belgorod region through on infiltration of a subversive group. They spoke about that subversive group being totally or mostly composed of Russian citizens supporting the Ukrainian army. I would like to know the reaction